So some of you may know that I'm a computer programmer and I've been playing video games since the 1970s, and I've written video games, etc. And I've made a lot of suggestions that are in the game. Easily 50 suggestions. Some of them were very big suggestions. One of them has to do with Frontline. Before Frontline came out, they had something called the Grand Battle, or at least they were talking about, why don't we take the map and make it bigger? And they had something like Big Ensk, and they talked about how they hired a group to make the Grand Battle design. And I go in the forums and I send suggestions through customer support. I've sent like 300 suggestions. And sometimes I write letters and I send them in the mail to the Minsk office. I've only sent a few, but one of them had to do with big maps. If you look in the NA forum, you will find that I posted something about how to make big maps, but it doesn't go into as much detail. So I'm going to go into all the details as to why Frontline works and could be much larger. The reason why is because it's broken up into zones. So when you play, you're only playing in your zone. And when you leave your zone, for performance reasons, it's going to load the next zone in, and the zone that you left will be removed from memory. And by doing so, you can not only increase the performance, but you could make huge maps. You can make maps as big as you have space on the hard drive. So we're going to talk a little bit about the map itself. In terms of being 9K by 9K, the map essentially is terrain. And the way 3D works, let's see if we could pull something up for terrain. So you can see what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about terrain, but we're going to look at what's called a solid. Let's see if we get a good image. Solid wireframe. I'll put solid wireframe is what it's called. Then you're going to see. This is solid wireframe over here. This is a good example where it says lines background. Here's a good example. So you see here, this is the actual terrain that makes up the entirety of the map. And this doesn't use up that much memory. You could make it huge. And these big mountains, this big mountain over here uses up the same amount of memory as the flat area. So essentially the terrain, you can make it huge, not that big of a deal. And then you have other things that are objects. You have the bushes, you've got the buildings, you've got other objects which could be an airplane or a truck or a little barrel. The list goes on. The size of the object doesn't matter. What matters is the detail. So we're going to do a 3D house object. So we'll use this house over here as an example. If you take away some of the details, like some of the doors away or the windows away, it will render faster. But if you scale the house, make it bigger or smaller, it has no impact on the rendering. So when you have a map, the maps have objects like buildings. Like south of Cap A, there are buildings over here. And Cap B has buildings, and there's some in the north. Cap C has a small number of buildings. F has buildings up here on the East Ridge. E has buildings at the Cap. And on the right over here, D has some structures. And then up here in the north, obviously, there's buildings. And you notice that 4, the buildings are relatively large. Those, when you go from A to B, you don't need those buildings in the game anymore. So you pull them from the game and you load in the new buildings. It can cause a performance hit. Like if you might remember that there was a time when you would go from one zone into the other and the game would stutter a little bit, and they eventually fixed it. And that's when they're getting rid of buildings and loading in new buildings. When you get rid of buildings, you free them up from memory. All you got to do, getting rid of 100 buildings could be the same as getting rid of one building, because they're probably in a linked list. It's like a chain. You just have to get rid of the start, and the rest of them become The memory is a fixed size. The space becomes available for someone else to use it, is basically what it is. That's the proper way to say deleting something. You're basically making the space available. When you load in objects, it's a different story. You literally got to load in every house. When you get rid of them, you don't have to get rid of every house. They will be gotten rid of lightning quick because of the linked list format. If they're not in a linked list, then you might have to do each one individually, but nobody's going to do it that way. Well, I guess it depends on how they design it. So loading in all the objects, all the buildings, all the bushes, all that stuff takes time. When you go from one zone into another, there's going to be a little bit of a stutter if you have a slow computer as it loads in all the objects. So there's a way to fix that, and it has to do with the terrain, with the mountains, which we saw on this wireframe image. You cannot see what's behind the mountains when you're on the other side. So what you do is you put mountains up between all the zones, so you cannot see what's in the other zone. So they don't have to load those houses, and those houses are not loaded into your game. When you go into the other zone, the houses will load in. However, there's other mountains and slopes blocking your view as you go into that zone. So if you're between A and B, you can't see the houses at A and you can't see the houses at B. They adjust either the hill or the mountains so that you cannot see all those buildings. And the same with D and E. If you go from D into E, you'll notice that they have little slopes and hills or mountains to block you from seeing all the buildings in each zone. And the same with going from E to F. When you go from E into F, the rail line and these mountains block you from seeing all the buildings on the far ridge. So as you cross over, it's loading them all into the game, and you don't notice that they're loading in one by one if you got a slow computer. As you go into the north, they did not use the mountains going from south into the north, but what they used are large buildings. And as I explained before, it doesn't matter if an object is a big building or a small building. What matters is how much detail it has. Like the house that I'm highlighting here has very low detail. It will load very quickly. And this house will take way longer to load because it has a lot more detail. Again, this one will load quickly because it has little detail. This one has little detail. So what you do when you're going into the north is you have lots of big buildings, because there is actually some terrain. When you go from D into 1, there are bushes and there's a wall and there's a little bit of a slope and there's a little hill and there's big buildings blocking the view off in the distance, large objects. And the same going from E into 3, you've got a lot of large buildings. And as you go around E, the slopes in the mountains block your view of the buildings on E. And with D, what they did, they didn't use a slope. They put up a giant wall in the north around the D cap to block your view of all the objects on the D cap. So that's another little trick they use. When you go from F into 5, they've got all these mountains blocking the faraway buildings, and they've got like the soccer stadium, which is a large object, which means it's with low detail, which loads in relatively quickly. So that's one of the tricks that you use so that if you have a slow computer, you don't see that what they're doing is they're dropping one. If you see each map A as being independent from D, they drop A, load in D as you cross into D, and as you leave D, they drop D and they load in 1, etc. And they place all the buildings between 1 and 3 and 5 so that the same thing happens. As you move from one into the other, you see how there's a ridge over here from 1 to 2? You have to go to the south. You can't cross over wherever you want. They do that so that as you cross over, they're blocking a view of lots of the buildings. And with 4, the way they did it is they made large buildings with few crossovers, and with 3, they've got just this large hill. And as I explained before with terrain, the memory and the speed for a large hill is the same as for a flat area, because all it is a point. This is 0.11, this is 1.2, this is 1.3, and it has an altitude. It's X, Y, and Z, and that is it and nothing more. And then they have something which puts the color. So what they'll do is they'll take a slope. The slope is obviously from one point to the next point. This might have a slope of 1. This might have a slope of 2. If the slope is 2, it's a mountain, so it's a dark brown color. If the slope is 0, it's green, and that's it. And then you've got the terrain colors. So it's really easy to do the terrain, and doing a large map, piece of cake. Really easy, doesn't take up a lot of memory. In fact, when game designers design maps, the first thing they do is a terrain. It's just a piece of cake, and it's usually one of the higher performance aspects of the game. You notice how the mountain comes to a point. They're jagged edges, but when you play the game, it looks smooth. The map is really pointed. The Frontline map and all the maps in World of Tanks and every 3D game, they're all pointed and jagged. But when it comes to rendering, they use a trick called smoothing. We'll look up smoothing algorithm. We'll do 3D smoothing. They use smoothing, 3D map smoothing. They use what's called a smoothing algorithm. You can see this looks like this might be an example where it takes jagged edges and it makes them round. The one on the left is jagged, the one on the right is round. So they smoothen everything out through software as it's being rendered. Here's another example. There's smoothing and there's shading. You see you've got a cube, and then they've got something to add shade, which is a shadow. It's just an algorithm. And then they've got something that rounds the edges. This rounded object on the right with the shadows and everything is actually a cube in the game, which is good for performance. But when it's rendered, that's why you have different graphic settings. You have high, medium, low, ultra high. What it's doing is it's adding, should we round the edge? Should we add shading? And you're turning on more to the right. And if you use the low settings, you're more to the left. And every time it has to run the next computation, it's going to take longer, which means you need the faster computer. So that's a little bit about how you do the maps. It's a technique that a lot of people really don't know about. I've known about it for a long time because I've been playing video games for a long time. I will tell you where I discovered this technique. It was from a video game called Fairy Tale Adventure. I will type it in. Fairy Tale Adventure, probably for the Commodore 64. This could be it. Or maybe for the Amiga. So basically, when I played the game, what I noticed is that as the character walked north, there would be a little hesitation as it loaded in the next segment. But when I went back south, it was cached, so there was no speed loss. So I noticed that, what they're doing is because, I'm a computer programmer. What I noticed is what they were doing is they're loading in the map as the guy's walking into the next area. If you walk slowly, the map is preloaded. So when he gets into there, high speed. But if you run as fast as quickly to the north, eventually you'll hit the limit of the cache and it will start loading it in slowly. So that's a technique you use for a game like Frontline. By doing so, you could add it bigger and bigger and bigger. You can make it as big as you want. The way Grand Battles was done probably does not use this technique. It doesn't use the zone format. It doesn't divide the game using mountains or using rolling hills so that you block the view of all the buildings. It doesn't use that technique, which means that it probably uses other tricks regarding performance to allow the map to be bigger. And as the note says, if you have a slower computer, you might have problems playing the map. It plays fine on my computer, but then again, I haven't tried playing it with the high graphics resolution. So in some cases, like between E and F, there's no mountain blocking the view, there's no buildings. How do they do it? Well, if you're at F, there is the rail that goes over this slope. It's open spaces, relatively few buildings and objects between E and F. And that's the reason why there's not a performance hit. And you'll notice if you're at F, where let's say you're at F with the bridges, I don't know if you can see that cursor. Let's see if you can see it. No, I guess you can't see the cursor. So you can't see what I'm pointing at. But the bridge at F When it looks into E, what's the first building? It's a triangular building, which you see on the north of E, and it blocks all the smaller buildings. So that's an example of what they do to block detail. And one of the other aspects you're going to notice about Frontline, there's really not a lot of bushes in Frontline as compared to some of the other games like Murovanka, which is detail heavy. And that's one of the trade-offs you have when you make a large map that's loading in all the zones as you go in from one zone into another. So, like I was saying before, I'm constantly writing ideas. I would make a list. I would say, if you want to make a big map, the Grand Battles way is the wrong way to do it. What you got to do is divide it into zones, load in each zone, use the mountains to divide it, make the hills rolling hills to block the line of sight so you can't see far away. And I would make this and I would send it to customer support. One of these days, I'm going to go through customer support. You'll be surprised at some of the suggestions that I made that were made into the game. Big things, like marathon missions were my idea going back to 2013. The damage indicators, which shows like how many hit points you got hit for and how wide it is dependent on how much damage you took. That was also one of my idea submissions. The 25 times zoom was one of my ideas. There were smaller things, there were cosmetic things, bug fixes, the list goes on. The Northwest map was my quarry map idea. The map forum is gone. Because this is maps, it's possible I posted it in the map forum and we don't know if we lost those because I don't know where the quarry map suggestion is. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments, please post below. Like one of the things that they had to do, I figured out that you could destroy all the objectives from far away with HE rounds. So what they had to do was they had to make it so that you couldn't damage the side with artillery. They made it harder. They strengthened the side armor for HE rounds. And I was one of the sandbox testers for Frontline, and I made a video that shows you how to do it. It was many years ago. And you could, these sandbox, there's a sandbox forum somewhere for World of Tanks, and you can go there and you can see my post that explains all of the ideas that I had to fix, for example, killing the objectives from far away. And what they did was they changed the terrain so that you couldn't damage them. Like all you got to do is put a building in the way and you change the terrain to make it difficult. And then I go back and I find a new way to do it, you know. So that's one of the things that happened. Okay, if you have any questions or comments, please post below.